President Mnangagwa rushed back to Harare from a meeting in Cape Town to praise the man who had once tried to have him killed.
The death early this morning in Singapore of the founder of our nation and iconic leader of our struggle for national liberation, Comrade Robert Mugabe, leaves a big void in our nation.
Robert Gabriel Mugabe, liberation hero, father of the Zimbabwean nation, cruel dictator.
He was a good leader. He was a good leader.
He was an iconic, he was an African legend. His only mistake was that he overstayed in power.
A champion of the anti-colonial struggle.
We will forever remember President Mugabe as a gallant leader of Pan-Africanism, of the independence of Africa.
I, Robert Gabriel Mugabe, do swear that I will be faithful and bear true allegiance to Zimbabwe.
At independence, Robert Mugabe was internationally respected as the liberator of his country. He's still revered by some, but reviled by others who blame him for beggaring the nation he founded, for destroying his own legacy. As a boy, he herded cattle and grew to resent the white man who owned the land of Rhodesia.
He was not a good mixer at all. He did not want. He was not an easy person to mix with. He was very reserved, and in school absolutely brilliant.
He became the leader of guerrillas fighting white minority rule in Rhodesia in the 1970s. The conflict shaped him, and in his mind never really ended.
The armed struggle will continue until a settlement of our own liking emerges.
Peace came with the signing of the Lancaster House Agreement with Lord Carrington in London.
I feel strongly the sense of hope which goes with having achieved so much.
But Mugabe never trusted his hosts. In the 60s, the colonial power had jailed him for a decade for opposing white rule. He'd not been allowed to attend his 3-year-old son's funeral, and he never forgave the British. In 1980, Britain finally let go. Rhodesia became Zimbabwe, and the Union flag was lowered for the last time. Bob Marley sang freedom songs, and Bob Mugabe's first speech as Prime Minister was a model of reconciliation.
Yesterday I fought you as an enemy. Today you have become a friend and ally, with the same national interest, loyalty, rights and duties as myself. If yesterday you hated me, today you cannot avoid the love that binds you to me and me to you.
But he had no love for his internal enemies, firing fellow freedom fighter Joshua Nkomo from his cabinet and unleashing the notorious 5th Brigade in Nkomo's home area of Matabeleland. 20,000 civilians were killed. The world turned a blind eye because leaders feared stirring up more trouble in Zimbabwe. Mugabe's wife Sally was a huge influence on him, but many say when she died and he married his secretary Grace, he lost any moral compass he might once have had. The second Mrs. Mugabe became known not as the First Lady, but the first shopper. Mugabe became president, the undisputed leader of Africa's breadbasket. Zimbabweans lived longer and more went to school. But for Mugabe, the well-being of his people came second to ideology and power. Zimbabwe's productive commercial farms were still largely in white hands. When white farmers started to fund a new opposition party, he called on veterans of the Liberation War and their followers to seize the land by whatever means. This was the continuation of the struggle, he said. The old colonial power had no right to criticize.
We are not a British colony. Come on, you must know that.
Tell him again. Tell him again.
We are not a British colony.
Tell him again.
What have the British to do with Zimbabwe? Who are you? You bloody idiots.
At rallies, he railed against the then British Prime Minister, Tony Blair.
So let Blair leave us in peace, please, please, please.
He was obsessed by gay men, lower than pigs and dogs, he said, especially those in the Blair government.
Let him attend to his gays and the gangsters, Vanatache Koko, many of whom are in his cabinet.
But he always loved the royal family and must have been deeply hurt when the Queen stripped him of his knighthood. In the 2002 elections, voters in the capital stormed the polling stations. His policies had made them poorer and they wanted him out. But polling agents were beaten up and rural voters stuck with Mugabe. In subsequent elections, thousands of opposition supporters were beaten and tortured, including the late opposition leader Morgan Tsvangirai. Poverty, deprivation, hyperinflation and queues for basic goods came to characterize the country. Decline was matched by wanton destruction. In 2005, Mugabe had the houses of urban dwellers bulldozed because most supported his opponents. In the end, the opposition caved to the inevitable. They were allowed into office as long as the old man remained on top.
To the deepening of cooperation between Zimbabwe and China.
After the West imposed sanctions, he courted China. We have turned east where the sun rises and given our back to the West, he said. Aged 90, he arrived at the state opening of Parliament in Harare in a vintage Rolls-Royce, accompanied by the neo-colonial pomp and circumstance on which he had always insisted. But he seemed half asleep and didn't notice that he was reading a speech he'd given a month earlier.
Ensure that our industries that they collapse,
and then stumbled and fell down the steps of his plane. His 91st birthday party reportedly cost $1 million. He would rule until he was 100, said his wife, who craved power herself.
I hereby confer certificates.
In 2017, he presided over a degree ceremony. He'd once said he had degrees in violence and that only God could remove him from office. But in the end, it was the Zimbabwean military who ousted him.
I, as the president of Zimbabwe,
he resisted to the last.
Sorry, one or two places.
Refusing to announce his resignation live on TV as he had promised the generals. But eventually he had no choice.
Notice of resignation.
When his letter of resignation was read to parliamentarians, they cheered, as did many citizens who had prayed for his era to end. The health facilities in Zimbabwe lack drugs and doctors. But Robert Mugabe died in a state-of-the-art hospital in faraway Singapore. The last pictures show him with his family, an old man who had ruled for 37 years before losing power, whose spirit will haunt Zimbabwe and Zimbabweans for years to come.
Lindsay Hilson reporting. Well, earlier I spoke to Wilfred Mbanga, a journalist who once knew Mugabe as a friend, but who suffered the president's wrath when he set up a critical newspaper in Harare, leading to 15 years of exile. I asked him what his earliest memories of Robert Mugabe were.
Yes, I met him for the first time in November of 1974, when they were released from prison. He had been in jail for more than 10 years. And one thing that impressed me about him was that he had no bitterness whatsoever, whereas a lot of his colleagues were talking of revenge, that they would punish whites for how they mistreated blacks and so on. But Mugabe was different from all these nationalist leaders. He felt that he was fighting against the system, not against the whites. And, he talked of reconciliation, which was amazing, and he'd been talking about this way back in 1974, and he meant it. And over the years, he changed.
Well, that's the question. Do you think he did change into something that, that was different, that was more tyrannical, more hard-edged? Or do you think these things were always in him?
Well, I think there was this, within this glove, there was an iron fist, On a personal level, he was very charming. He liked all the things that, I loved at the time. When I first met him, we you'd come to my house and would listen to music, would play Pat Boone or Elvis Presley or Jim Reeves, and would sing along and would eat sadza, which is a Zimbabwean staple diet, with pumpkin leaves and peanut butter. We loved. He was simple. He was a loving friend. He was, and he was to a fault. With people who were close to him, he did not judge them, and that's what happened. I think people took advantage of that, was they knew that as long as they were loyal to him, they could get away with murder. But if you cross swords with him, then he was absolutely a terror. He would destroy you, as he did in my case.
Well, what happened in your case? How did he turn on you?
So I formed, with a group of friends, a company that launched the first independent daily in Zimbabwe, which was critical of government. And he has never, to this day, he has never forgiven me for that.
Do you think ultimately it's a good thing he's gone?
Well, nobody celebrates a man's death. In Shona, we've got a saying, wafawanaka, when somebody dies, you wipe out all the bad things about them. But the problem is, his legacy will live on. He's destroyed agriculture. We're going to feel that for the next 20, 30 years. He's destroyed the economy. You can't fix it in a decade. He's destroyed the education system. He's destroyed our hospitals. So we begin to feel that legacy, the corruption that he allowed for many, many years. So he might be gone, but his legacy will live on.
Wilfred Mbanga talking to me earlier. Well, I also spoke to Violet Gonda, another Zimbabwean journalist who spent years in exile. I asked her what she remembered about Robert Mugabe from when she was young.
Growing up, he was a hero. Like for many Zimbabweans, they saw Mugabe as the father of Zimbabwe. He was one of our liberators, a real nationalist who helped bring independence to our country. And so there was this feeling of being awestruck. But then after independence, all that changed. From then on, he ruled Zimbabwe with an iron fist.
And why did you have to leave? And what did you think of him for all those years you couldn't be in your country?
I left because a group of us could not work in Zimbabwe as journalists, but I was able to go back just after he was removed in a coup 2 years ago. And it was quite different in terms of, for many years I had wanted I hated him, like many other Zimbabweans, because he had removed this, it is my right as a Zimbabwean to be able to go in and out of the country as I pleased, but he had taken that away from me. So returning home to Zimbabwe last year was sort of like refreshing for me, and also I had the opportunity to see Mr. Mugabe during the election period. And I thought I was going to vent out and really be angry at him. But when I finally saw him 20 years later, he just looked like this frail old man who had just lost it. And I could not believe that this is the man that had wreaked havoc on the masses for many years. In fact, I felt pity for him. And in a way, this is how I also feel now. We all thought we were going to die before Mugabe. We would hear so many reports of him going to Singapore or Malaysia for treatment, and we always thought, you know, he would always come back. So when we were told today that Mugabe has finally died, I felt nothing, which is very weird. But what is very sad is to see how the rest of Africa, especially, is mourning, you know, this man who was seen as a fearless fighter. Mugabe was seen as that person who dared challenge the white people, who dared challenge the West. But at the end of the day, the reality for Zimbabweans on the ground was totally different.
So how do you see the near future for Zimbabwe?
It is very difficult to guess because right now the reality is we have food shortages, we have 90% unemployment, we have fuel crisis. Many people spend a lot of time queuing for fuel, and the future is bleak.
And so your fear is that people will start looking back at him through rose-tinted spectacles?
It's already started. It has already started. People feel that life under Mugabe was better than what they are actually going through right now. And also, to be honest, even though he reigned with this tight fist, the new president right now, you would have thought he would do things differently. But nothing has changed. It's actually gotten worse. So people are worried that we might actually see someone who was worse than what was there when Mugabe was in power.